Merry met, virtual traveller, and welcome to Stories from Lore, a podcast that invites you to rewild yourself through story by exploring nature, folklore and the stories it inspires. My name is Dawn Nelson, and I'm an author, consultant and professional storyteller. Season 5 is here, and we begin with Born of Fire. For this season, we are diving into the medieval bestiaries to discover the strange and familiar creatures that lie within its pages. In this episode, we're exploring the creatures that are associated with fire, with the main focus being that well-loved and feared mythical creature, the dragon. The guardian waited ill-enduring till evening came. Boiling with wrath was the barrow's keeper, and fain with flame for foe to pay for the dear cup's loss. Now day was fled as the worm had wished. By its wall no more was it glad to bide, but burning flew, folded in flame, fearful beginning for the sons of the soil, and soon it came, in the doom of their lord, to a dreadful end. Then the baleful field its fire belched out, and bright homes burned. The blaze stood high, all landsfolk frighting. No living thing would that loathly one leave, as aloft it flew. Wide was this dragon's warring seen, its fiendish fury far and near, as the grim destroyers those Geatish people hated and hounded. To hidden lair, to its hoard it hastened at the hint of dawn. Folk of the land it had lapped in flame, with bale and brand. In its barrow it trusted, its battling and bulwarks. That boast was vain. To Beowulf then the bale was told, quickly and truly. The king's own home of building the best in brand waves melted, that gift throne of the Geat. This scene from Beowulf takes place on Beowulf's return home to the Geats after his victory over Grendel. It is told that 50 years of his reign has passed since he had to deal with Grendel and his mother, and these 50 years have passed relatively peacefully, until a servant steals a golden goblet from the dragon's hoard. As a result, was thas worms, why wide ye seen? Wide was the dragon's warring scene. The dragon is eventually Beowulf's demise, but not until Beowulf has dispatched the dragon and named Wiglaf as his successor. In the Old English version of Beowulf, you may at first glance think it's an impenetrable jumble of consonants and vowels, letters no longer used, and words that make no sense. But with a little extra knowledge about how to pronounce things, if you look a little deeper, there are plenty of words you may recognise. Fire is fire. Laithly is loathly. Worm is worm. This can mean a snake, earthworm, insect, reptile, or even a dragon. Lee is flame, and Lee Draka is flame dragon. Luftflogger is air flyer, and this can include Beowulf's dragon, because Luftflogger means anything that flies. So if that's what the Saxons thought about dragons and how they spoke about them, what did we think by the time we got to the 13th century? What of the lizards, worms and creatures of fire in the Bestiaries? For this season, as my reference, I'm using the MS Bodley 764 Bestiary, which is a 13th century manuscript translated by Richard Barber. First up, we have the phoenix. This is a fairly well-known mythological creature, and in the Bestiaries it's described as coming from Arabia and can live for 500 years. Once it feels it has got too old, it collects twigs from aromatic plants and builds a pyre, spreads its wings to the sun so that they reflect the heat and sets light to itself. From the ashes come a new bird. In this way, in some texts, the phoenix is used in the Christian religion to represent Jesus and his rise from the dead. Next up is the chameleon, which we now know today as a lizard. However, it's a pard in the Bestiaries. A pard is like a leopard, basically, so some kind of cat. But this one's colour changing. It has a neck of a horse, feet of an ox and head of a camel. Not at all like the chameleons that we recognise this day. If we're talking about worms or worms, well, then we have a wether, which is a goat-like creature that has worms in its head. And this means that it gets so irritating it butts heads with other wethers. Moving on from worms, which are in fact goats, we come to dragons. The dragon is the largest of all the serpents described in the Bestiary, and it is said to shake the air. It has a small mouth, a crest, narrow nostrils, and it is said to flick its tongue in and out of its mouth. It blows harmful poison, slays anything it embraces, and also makes the air glow. This is much more like the dragons that we know of in our own stories even to this day. Basilisks sometimes find themselves categorised under dragons. However, basilisks don't necessarily breathe fire. They can breathe poison, but one thing they do is kill you by just simply looking at you. A little like Medusa from the Greek myth. We then move to a section within the bestiary which lists lots of different types of essentially serpent. So we have an amphisbaena, which has two heads, one at the front and one at the back. It gets confused apparently and forms a kind of circle, and it likes frost, which is very much unlike any of the other snakes which prefer warmth. The boas of Italy are said to suck cattle dry of milk. This theme of serpents and milk does crop up quite a bit in English folklore as well. Then there is the laculus, which is a flying serpent that lurks in trees, and in order to catch its food, it throws itself on its prey, smothering it. Then there is the arbia, which is also known as a siren, but not like the sirens that we know in folklore that sit in the sea and lure sailors. This one is a poisonous white snake with wings, so again we're getting a bit closer to dragons. A seps is not something you want to come across. It attacks your feet and consumes your whole body by wasting it away. You could perhaps see how this ended up being recorded. It could have been that somebody was actually bitten by a snake, and that whilst it wasn't a poisonous snake, the bite became infected and they ended up developing a sepsis and wasting away and dying. So you can understand how that could have come about. Then there is a disper. A disper's an interesting one. Apparently you won't even know you've been killed by a disper. It'll be too late. And the disper leaves no trace of sadness on your face. So you die happy, basically. So I think of all of these, the disper's probably the best one to come across. The salamander doesn't breathe fire, but it lives amongst fire, and as a result, it is fireproof. The interesting thing that apparently it does do is it'll sit in a tree, and it does mention an apple tree, which follows because in a lot of mythology there are serpents in apple trees. And so it's possible that that's where this comes from again. But it sits in the tree and it infects all of the fruit, and then when you eat the fruit you yourself die, and therefore it kills many more people or prey, whatever you want to call it, and they end up with a very hearty meal. Thank you very much. The last one I have to share with you is this saura. The saura has some interesting behaviour, and it's possible that this is just an observation of normal lizard behaviour, because it is said that as a saura loses sight in old age, it regains its sight by peeking out of the wall where it's living and looking at the sun. So this could just describe any lizard that's basking, really. So that's the lizards and dragons of the bestiary, namely that MS Bodley 764. So let's have a look at dragons in general. Certainly in Western mythology, the dragon is terrifying, at best fighting among themselves, and at worst swooping through villages, killing everyone in sight and eating all the cows and the sheep. Sometimes they are the butt of jokes as well. However, they are rarely revered as they are in Eastern mythology. In the Eastern mythology, they are divine, and they often take different forms, such as the lion-headed Chinese dragons. But I'm going to stick with Western mythology for now. When those of us in the West think of dragons, more often than not, we're thinking of a scaly, clawed, horrendous-teethed, belching fire, poisonous, winged being. As with many folklore in Britain and Ireland, there are some regional differences with dragons, and I'm just going to visit a few of those for you. So the first up is a cockatrice, which is like that basilisk that I was talking about. The cockatrice can be found all over England, however there is quite a famous story of it which resides in Hampshire. It's a horrifying mix of cockerel, thorny wings and serpentine tail, and if you are lucky enough to spot a cockatrice, do not, whatever you do, look into its eyes. Its effects are that of a gorgon, as previously mentioned. Early signs that you are near its nest are the observance of a gathering of stone statues in a forest. The next one up is a knucker dragon, or a nikor. Nikor means water beast in Anglo-Saxon, but this is still a fire-breathing dragon, which is why I've included it in this episode. Like I say, its name is thought to have derived from this old Saxon word nikor, and it's a fearsome beast that can be found in a bottomless pool of water. And it also has a penchant for pies. Next up is the lindworm. This one appears in the moorland territories and up in the northeast. Sometimes appearing to the observer as a monstrous snake, the lindworm is a wingless dragon. Often it's a princess trapped in a serpent's skin. So beware of this dragon, because hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. There is also the red dragon of Wales. This is, of course, predominantly found in Wales, and this dragon can be a worthy ally. It was last seen fighting the white dragon, which of course belongs to England, before it fell into a pit filled with mead. It is not known if this dragon still exists or whether it's just lying in a pit of mead somewhere in Wales. Its habitat is mainly the Welsh fens. The last one I'd like to share with you is the wyvern. This dragon only has 2 legs rather than the usual 4, and the wyvern is a winged beast with an arrowhead tail. It's thought not to breathe fire, although to be fair, I don't think anyone's lived to confirm that fact. This one tends to hang about in the middle counties of England. Stories of these dragons always involve trickery, sometimes involve knights, and often involve pies. However, I will talk about that a little bit later on. For now, I'd like to talk to you about Pliny, because Pliny has a lot to say about dragons. For those of you who haven't met Pliny yet, Pliny was a Roman writer, naturalist and philosopher. And, well, he had a lot to say about many things, to be honest. Some of them were correct, but most of them not so. Either way, they're highly entertaining. And this is what Pliny thought about dragons. He believed that dragons were destitute of venom. I would go so far as to say that Pliny was out and out wrong on this account, because there are so many other accounts of dragons being poisonous. Pliny obviously didn't think they were. Thankfully, he didn't come across any to test that. He did believe that there were various things you could do with parts of dragons for good health and luck. He believed that if you dried out the eyes and mixed them with honey, then you could make a rub out of this which would alleviate nightmares and nighttime ghostly visions. I guess a little like a Vicks vapor rub. Not sure I'd want to try that. If you manage to get the whole head of the dragon, well then if you bury this beneath the threshold of your door, well then that would bring good luck, or just a bad smell. I mean, if you had hold of the head, then I should imagine you would have some of the dragon's fat, and dragon's fat is thought to repel venomous creatures, so you'd be quite safe from any kind of snakes or other dragons. If you were out and about in dragon country and you wanted to make sure that you weren't attacked by a dragon, well then all you needed to do was cover yourself in a tincture of nettle and vinegar and, well, the dragons would be sure to fly away, apparently. Dragons had very particular behaviour according to Pliny as well. In the spring they would wake up from their hibernation and they'd feel quite sick, and they'd alleviate this with lettuce juice. I quite like the idea of a dragon drinking a lettuce smoothie. Also, according to Pliny, in a slightly less vegan way, dragons were particularly partial to elephant blood, and great battles were fought between the 2 of them. This is perhaps reminiscent of the Komodo dragon, which you can find in Indonesia. However, if you look at the size of the Komodo compared to an elephant, there's no way it would take an elephant down. But there are some articles which suggest that it is potentially so that when pygmy elephants were around, Komodo dragons ate those. That is more likely. So again, perhaps there is a seed of fact in this writing. And that brings us to the dragons that we can find in the world today. Because, dear listener, dragons still do exist. The obvious choice for this is the Komodo, as I've previously mentioned, or the monitor lizard, as they're also known. This is an armoured scaled apex predator that can reach up to 3 metres long and has a poisonous bite. It's native to Indonesia, so we're unlikely to come across it here in the UK, and they stand out from other reptiles as they hunt in groups. It is truly a formidable predator, and you would not want to get in its way. There are plenty of the Komodo dragon's smaller relatives though. Lizards reminiscent of dragons exist across the globe. Frilled lizards, flying lizards and horned lizards, just to name a few. All these creatures pose little threat to us now, however they are a reminder of the Earth's ancient Jurassic past and the ultimate dragons, dinosaurs. Bringing it back to the modern day again though, in the UK the only venomous lizard we have is an adder, and that is more likely to slink away into the heather than bother to bite you. One of my local heathlands holds 12 of the 13 species of UK native reptiles and amphibians, and is the only one in the UK to do so. The 13 species are the common lizard, sand lizard, grass snake, adder, smooth snake, slow worm, common frog, pool frog, common toad, natterjack toad, smooth newt, palmate newt and crested newt. The only reason that particular heathland doesn't have all 13 is because pool frogs are currently only found in one place in the UK, and that's not local to me. In fact, very few people know where it is at all, as it must be kept secret to prevent those precious few pond frogs being unnecessarily disturbed. Of course, we can also look to the skies for dragons. There are 36 different species of dragonfly in the UK, the biggest of which is the golden-ringed dragonfly at almost 9 centimetres long, and you only have to walk along the edges of a river or a stream to find some. So you may think that dragons are no longer with us, but in actual fact, all you have to do is take a walk on the heaths, along the canals, find a local pond or a sunny woodland glade, and you'll find that you don't have to wait too long before you were in the company of dragons. In the 11 years that I've been telling stories, I have told many a dragon story, and they often involve baking pies or large citrus puddings that placate the dragon and ensure that it moves on and causes no further harm. Locally, by which I mean Hampshire and Sussex in the UK, we have a few different stories that I'm just going to briefly share with you. There's the Werewall Cockatrice, which takes place in a town called Werewall, and it is where a toad hatched out a rooster's egg. I don't know how the rooster laid the egg, but it did. And out of the egg came a cockatrice. The cockatrice at first was considered to be a nice little pet and was fed meat, and nobody really thought anything of it until it got far too big and started to get a taste for human flesh. It was then placed down in the crypt of the church to try and keep it out of the way. However, it was very difficult to manage, and a decree was set out that somebody really ought to come and fix this pesky cockatrice. As a result, somebody did find a way to kill it. What they did was they placed a mirror down into the crypt so that the cockatrice attacked itself and turned itself to stone with that gorgon gaze that I talked about earlier. So that was the end of the Werewall Cockatrice. There is still a record of this in the church at Werewall if you're interested in taking a little story trail down there. There are also several dragons that are responsible for creating landmarks within the area. There's one in the New Forest in Hampshire called the Bestiary dragon, and one in Sussex called the Bignor dragon. They are Burley Beacon for the Bestiary dragon and Bignor Hill for the Bignor dragon. These two dragons were said to place themselves on this hill and wrap their tails around the hill. In the case of the Bignor dragon, you can see lines where the dragon put its tail around the hill. These are, of course, lynchets, which are there from years of farming. However, the dragon story is much more romantic, isn't it? Finally, there is that dragon called the Knucker dragon, which I mentioned earlier, which potentially comes from the old Saxon stories. This Knucker dragon has to be one of the most famous local stories of them all, and so it's this story that I'd like to tell you. This story takes place in Sussex, which is just across the border from me, but there are many people in Hampshire who also know of this dragon. And I again tell several different versions of this tale because it depends which audience I'm telling for. If I'm telling for children, well, then this involves an apple pie rather than the pie that Jim Puttock feeds the fated beast. But for the purposes of this podcast, I will be telling you the original story of the Lyminster Knucker dragon, or at least my version of it. Once upon a time, a long time ago, in the town of Lyminster, there was a large hole, a deep hole full of water. It was so deep that nobody really knew how deep it was, and so some of the men from the town decided that they would find out by taking the bell from the local church and dropping it down the hole. I think they must have worked out how much time it took each time the bell rang, and so how much distance it would travel, but I don't know, that's maths, folks. I do the words, not maths. But these guys had decided they could work it out. So they dropped the bell down the Knucker hole, and they waited, and they listened. And as far as I know, it's still ringing, still to this day. If you go and stand next to that hole, it's said that you can hear the bell ringing. What it did do, though, is on its way down, it woke up a dragon which was asleep on a ledge. This dragon came up out of the water hole, dripping with water, with a horrible, noxious breath, with fire, great big teeth, claws, scales the size of dinner plates. It was doing all the things that dragons do. The men were obviously terrified and ran away, and this dragon then proceeded to terrorise the town for many, many days and weeks and months to come. It would fly down into the town, and anybody who was not in their house would get eaten. Any kind of cows or sheep or pigs would also get eaten up. This dragon had a monstrous appetite. And so it was that there was a decree sent out across the land to say that anybody who could rid Lyminster of their dragon, well, they would be greatly rewarded. Knights came from miles around. They came up to the knucker-hole, they waited for the dragon to emerge, and they tried their best to kill that dragon. But that dragon, that was a mean beast. It was not going to be killed by some tiny, puny humans. Instead, it picked up the knights and it shelled them like prawns. They were no match for this dragon. It got to the point where nobody wanted to live in Lyminster anymore. The trade was drying up. The farmers couldn't keep their cattle there anymore. It was going to become a ghost town. When a young man called Jim Puttock hit upon an idea for getting rid of this dragon. One day he took a trip out into the woods and he found all of the mushrooms that was really not advisable to eat. The agarics, the death caps, the web caps and the panther caps, every single one of them he found, and he put them into an enormous dragon-sized pie. He then staggered across to the knucker-hole and placed this pie down beside the knucker-hole. He waited for the dragon to come up out of the hole, which it did. It came up out of the water with all of the water dripping off it, with the teeth and the claws, the noxious breath and the flames, and doing all the things that dragons do. And it looked at Jim Puttock and it went to eat him when he... Oh, what is that? It smelled the massive mushroom pie. And instead of eating Jim Puttock, it swallowed the pie whole. Now, this was a big dragon, so it wasn't going to kill it outright, but it did knock it out. It knocked it out long enough for Jim Puttock to take one of the swords that were lying about from the knights that had been there last and lop off the dragon's head. He then dragged the dragon's head down to the local pub, burst in the door and showed everybody, "Look, I've killed the dragon. Am I a good fella or what?" Well, of course, they were overjoyed. They didn't really mind that there was dragon blood dripping all over the floor. The dragon was dead. They brought the dragon's head in. They danced around it. They lifted Jim up. They carried him around the pub singing, "For he's a jolly good fellow, for he's a jolly good fellow." And then they lined up the pints on the bar for Jim to celebrate. Jim lifted the first pint up and he took a good gulp of it. He placed it back down on the bar and there was froth across the top of his lip and he could feel it. So he wiped it away with the back of his hand. And within minutes of doing that, he dropped down dead. Because, gentle listener, he had not washed his hands after making the mushroom pie. And that is a lesson to us all. Thanks for joining me around the hearth for this episode of Stories from Lore. For more folklore and stories, you can subscribe to my Substack newsletter. Just hop over to the Substack site and search for Ceridwen's Cauldron, or use the link in the show notes. You can upgrade to paid for just £5 a month to access extended episodes in the archives, extras, and this season, an exclusive monthly podcast for subscribers called The Story Forecast, which suggests stories that follow the wheel of the year to help you weather the storms of life. Signing up as a paid or free subscriber is much appreciated and helps to support the podcast and my work with folklore and story. As well as Substack, you can find me on Instagram and Facebook as The Bard Dawn. Reviews are always gratefully received and your support is greatly appreciated. I hope to see you there, as I'd love to tell you another story. Until next time, toodle pip.